Oof. So now we finished with that great big endeavor, and now we're on to the autonomic nervous system. So what are the divisions of the nervous system that we'll talk about again, just to help reorient you? So you've got the central nervous system, right, which is your brain and your spinal cord. And then you peripheral nervous system, that is where cranial and spinal nerves that contain both sensory and motor fibers. So basically, it's all of the nerves that are not directly in it. The peripheral nervous system is your nerves, so your central nervous system is made up specifically of your brain and your spinal cord and what's immediately attached to that. But the peripheral nervous system are the cranial and spinal nerves that come off of it and are bringing in both sensory and motor fibers. And so this peripheral nervous system connects the CNS to muscles, glands, and all sensory receptors. So because it's so broad, if your central nervous system is just your brain and your spinal cord, and your peripheral nervous system is everything else, there have to be divisions of that everything else in order to better understand it, right? So these are subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system. You've got the somatic nervous system, which is also called the voluntary one, because it's involved in what's considered voluntary movements. So the afferent fibers there, remember, afferent is sensory afferent. But these neurons are from cutaneous and special sensory receptors to the CNS. The efferent ones there, the motor neurons there, are to skeletal muscle tissue. So those are going to be the ones that are innervating your skeletal muscles in order for them to move. Then you have the autonomic nervous system, which is what we'll be focusing on here, which is for involuntary movements and actions. So this gets sensory neurons from the visceral organs to the CNS, and motor neurons to smooth and cardiac muscle and glands. So there's a sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And in one of the examples that the sympathetic division does is it speeds up heart rates. And then the parasympathetic division, which slows down heart rates. And then you have your enteric nervous system that we talked about before, where like the gut is so complex that it's got its own plexuses of nerves in order to immediately sense and change and respond to things that are going on within it. So like we said, these are neurons and enteric plexuses that extend the length of the GI tract. And many of these neurons of the enteric plexuses function in conjunction with and along with the ANS and the CNS. So technically it's not like 100% self-sufficient because there is involvement from other areas, but it's a good way to distinguish it when you're talking about specific parts sometimes. And so this is that organization of the nervous system, this picture that we've seen a lot, but again, we're going to focus right here with the autonomic nervous system. So more about the autonomic nervous system. So this particular division of the nervous system regulates activity of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and certain glands. And this usually operates without conscious control. If you had to think about every little thing that the body does throughout the day, you could not do anything else. Like there's so much going on right now. So the autonomic nervous system is what covers a lot of that involuntary function. It receives input from the limbic system and other regions of the cerebrum. And then it includes autonomic sensory neurons, integrating centers in the CNS, and autonomic motor neurons. Sorry, it was a tongue twister. But this division is regulated by the hypothalamus and the brainstem. So remember, we just talked about all of that and how like it's involved with kind of like homeostatic input throughout the body. That's a big part of this. So it's regulated by the hypothalamus and the brainstem. The somatic nervous system contains both sensory and motor neurons. And so the somatic sensory neurons will receive input from receptors of the special and somatic senses. These sensations are consciously perceived. So those are ones that are happening, like sensations that are consciously received. So when they say like the special senses, those are the ones like vision and smell and hearing. So like you very much so know that those are going on, like because you're looking at this presentation right now, you're seeing it and interpreting it and doing that like intentionally, and smells and sounds, like those are things that you have to be like present in order to interpret. But somatic motor neurons innervate skeletal muscle and produce consciousness and voluntary movements. So the responses that go with some of the things that you might see, hear, and smell, as well as making decisions about the movements that you're trying to make. You can tell yourself run, and you'll go run. So those are those voluntary movements. But the motor neurons in this division always produce EPSPs. But back to the autonomic nervous system, it contains both autonomic sensory and motor neurons. So the autonomic sensory neurons are associated with interoceptors, and the autonomic sensory input is not consciously perceived. So it's kind of the opposite of what we just discussed. Like you don't intentionally know what the sensory receptors in this system are doing within the body. But it also receives sensory input from somatic senses and special sensory neurons. So it does have some innervation that comes from these, as well as sensation, in order to know how to properly respond to it from an automatic perspective. The autonomic motor neurons will regulate visceral activities by producing either EPSPs or IPSPs, so remember excitatory or inhibitory, that affect ongoing activities of like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Those are going to be the three. If you ever want to know if something's under autonomic control, remember these things. Is it cardiac muscle? Is it smooth muscle? Or is it a gland? If it is, then it's under autonomic control. But most autonomic responses cannot be consciously altered or suppressed. So what are some divisions of autonomic output? So the efferent part of the autonomic nervous system is divided into two principal parts. So you've got the sympathetic division, which is, it's got thoracolumbar innervation, meaning that it's centrally located along the thorax and the lumbar portion of the spinal cord. And then you've got the parasympathetic division, which means that its main points are coming from the it's craniosacral, sorry. So its main points are coming from the cranial region of the spinal cord and the sacral portions. So organs that receive impulses from both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers are said to have dual innervation. So it's dual innervation because it's coming from two places, remember, and those are the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. For organs that receive dual innervation, the effects of the two divisions are opposite to each other. So essentially it's like, if one, if the one division is what speeds up the heart rate, the other division is what's going to slow it down, that kind of thing. So your sympathetic system tends to fuel behavior that's known as your fight or flight syndrome. So that's when your heart rate increases with sympathetic stimulation. So that was a good example of what I just gave. So your sympathetic stimulation is going to cause your heart rate to increase. So on the flip side of that, your parasympathetic division is what's going to cause your heart rate to decrease. But again, that sympathetic stimulation is like fight or flight. So when you think of that immediate fear response, that's usually a sympathetic action. The parasympathetic system tends to cause things that are associated with the rest or vegetative state. So heart rate decreases with parasympathetic stimulation, like we just discussed. But they call the sympathetic division fight or flight. So the parasympathetic division is often called rest and digest. So it's the more it's the one that's involved with slowing down the heart rate and also involved in digestive processes and things like that. So let's compare somatic and autonomic nervous systems to each other. So based off of type of sensation, somatic sensation is consciously perceived, while autonomic sensation is unconsciously perceived, and it's visceral sensation, so mostly from your organs. Based on the type of motor output, somatic nervous system is voluntary, and it's got excitatory action potentials that go to skeletal muscle, whereas autonomic is involuntary, and it could either be inhibitory or excitatory to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The number of neurons in the motor pathway between the gray matter of the spinal cord and effectors, the number of neurons will matter here. But so in somatic, it's just one, it's just one neuron that's going in order to make that happen, to send that information out. But in the autonomic, it's two. And that's what we discussed a while back. If you go back in the presentations, you'll see where we talked about that. But it's due because that first autonomic motor neuron has its cell body in the central nervous system, and its myelinated axon extends into the autonomic ganglion. That second autonomic neuron has its cell body in that autonomic ganglion, and its unmyelinated axon extends to whatever effector it needs to go to. So there's autonomic input to the adrenal medulla, and so that's what essentially, when people think about that fight or flight response, that's your adrenaline, and adrenaline is coming from your adrenal medulla. So that's where that epinephrine and norepinephrine response comes from in order to make those immediate sensations occur. Okay, so now we have neurotransmitters for the somatic versus the autonomic nervous system, right? So this is you to be able to see like the different portions of it that are coming. But those neurotransmitters for the somatic portion, your motor neurons are going to produce acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. But for the autonomic ones, all the preganglionic neurons are also going to produce acetylcholine. For the sympathetic nervous system, most of the preganglionic neurons are going to produce norepinephrine. And so that's like the exceptions are going to be like the sweat glands because they'll also release acetylcholine. But the adrenal medulla will produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. As far as like parasympathetic innervation would be postganglionic neurons, and they'll secrete acetylcholine. So when it's talking about like just like the one neuron doing something, that's when you're going to be looking at like acetylcholine. But when you see like these specific like sympathetic and parasympathetic branches, that's when you might have some differences. So like we said, the sympathetic one will have norepinephrine, except for the sweat glands, they'll be doing acetylcholine, but the parasympathetic postganglionic neurons will have acetylcholine. And this is just that same image from before, like further depicting what's going on. So you can see like what's happening, like preganglionic and postganglionic with autonomic motor neurons, and as well as like what's happening with the adrenal medulla. And then the same like preganglionic parasympathetic and postganglionic parasympathetic. So you're looking at like sympathetic innervation up here, parasympathetic innervation up here, and then looking at like how it directly affects the adrenal medulla. And remember, your adrenal gland is right on top of your kidney. So basically what's happening there. So let's look at the basic anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. You have a preganglionic neuron that's myelinated, right? So this is where the cell body of the preganglionic neuron is going to be present in the brain or spinal cord. So like the cell body of it is directly in the central nervous system. The axon is a myelinated type B fiber, and that's going to extend to the autonomic ganglion. So remember, the cell bodies or whatever, the nuclei are in the central nervous system, ganglions are in the peripheral nervous system. So in this particular case, that's good. Like that preganglionic fiber is going to make it to the autonomic ganglion. The postganglionic neuron is where the cell body lies outside the CNS in that autonomic ganglion, right? And so this axon is unmyelinated, and it's a type C fiber, and it's what it winds up going to a visceral effector. So you can see that in this image up here where this preganglionic fiber, its cell body is here in the spinal cord, right? And so it travels until it can get to this autonomic ganglion, and that stimulus is going to release acetylcholine. And so then it's going to travel down an unmyelinated postganglionic factor in order to get to whatever effector it's going to, whether that be like a smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland or something. And it'll release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine, depending on what it's trying to do. So your parasympathetic versus your sympathetic autonomic nervous system. So discussing them separately, this is your sympathetic division, And you can see that this sympathetic division is thoracolumbar, right? So it's getting all of this information that is coming from the thoracic portion of the spinal cord as well as the lumbar portion, and sending that out to the appropriate entities wherever it needs to go, right? Versus like the parasympathetic one, which we'll see on right here, the parasympathetic one on the next slide. It is craniosacral, meaning that all of its information is going to be coming from the cranial portion of the spinal cord as well as the sacral portion of the spinal cord. So passing that information on to the appropriate entities, you can follow it there. So these images discuss like where those innervations go, what they do. So I would familiarize yourself with these two pictures. As far as sympathetic ganglia go, like we said, the sympathetic trunk, which is also called like the vertebral chain or the paravertebral ganglia. So they lie in a vertical row on either side of the vertebral column, right? So left and right sides or whatever of the vertebral column. The prevertebral ganglia will lie anterior to the spinal column, so more cranial to the spinal column and close to the large abdominal arteries. And so those are like the celiac. These are all listed for you here. The parasympathetic ganglia are going to have like terminal or intramural ganglia, and so they're located very close to, or actually within, the visceral organ of what they're going to affect. So you can see that in these images here, but so it'll have like a ciliary, pterygopalatine, submandibular, otic ganglia, and so you can familiarize yourself with those. But those essentially are like specific tracks that like they'll follow in order to pass that sensory information onward. But as far as like dual innervation goes for autonomic ganglia, remember, so the sympathetic division is thoracolumbar, and the preganglionic cell bodies are in the thorax and the first two lumbar segments of the spinal cord. The ganglia are going to be in like that trunk or chain near the vertebral bodies. The prevertebral ganglia are near the large blood vessels in the gut, versus like the parasympathetic one, which remember is craniosacral, and its preganglionic cell bodies are in the nuclei of 4 cranial nerves and the sacral spinal cord, and its ganglia are in the terminal ganglia in the wall of the organ. And so that's just a nice side-by-side comparison of the two. But as far as autonomic plexuses go, these are like tangled networks of sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. They lie along major arteries, because remember, you're going to have, for like that dual innervation, there will be some stimuli that make the sympathetic innervation occur and others that will cause a parasympathetic response. So they need to be close to each other, because it's not like one's going to work for like 20 minutes and then the other one's going to work for like 20 minutes. Sometimes they are working back and forth in order to control whatever process is going on within the body. So some major autonomic plexuses include the cardiac plexus, the pulmonary plexus, and the celiac plexus, and the superior mesenteric plexus and the inferior mesenteric plexus, the renal plexus, and the hypogastric plexus. I would suggest you remember all of those. So the plexuses are also present in this picture. So like I said, these images are going to be really good for you as far as like studying material and figuring out where like the ganglia are, as well as like these specific innervations that take place and what they might go to and what they cause in the different effector organs. But so sympathetic, you'll see the cardiac plexus, the pulmonary plexus, and the celiac or solar plexus, the superior mesenteric plexus, and the inferior mesenteric plexus, as well as hypogastric. The autonomic, the parasympathetic ones, you'll still have those situations. So you have cardiac plexus, pulmonary plexus, celiac plexus, superior mesenteric plexus, inferior mesenteric plexus, and the hypogastric. So you can see that like they both have innervations and things that will occur in these specific plexuses, as well as different actions that will happen based off of whether that's parasympathetic or sympathetic innervation. So what are some structures of the sympathetic nervous system? There are preganglionic cell bodies from T1 to L2. So remember, that's the first thoracic vertebrae and down to the second lumbar vertebrae. Well, those areas, right? The rami communicantes, which is essentially this body, but we'll break it down. So there's like a white ramus that's part of it, and the white ramus is myelinated, and it's got preganglionic fibers. And then you have a gray ramus that's unmyelinated, and it's got postganglionic fibers. And so then you have postganglionic cell bodies, and so you've got sympathetic chain ganglia that are along the spinal column, the prevertebral ganglia at a distance. So they're separated from them from a distance from the spinal cord. And so from them you'll see the celiac ganglion, the superior mesenteric ganglion, the inferior mesenteric ganglion, and those will be the ones that we'll focus through. But like the sympathetic preganglionic neurons pass to the sympathetic trunk, and so they may connect to postganglionic neurons in the following ways. So they might synapse with postganglionic neurons in the ganglion that it first reaches. So, we talked about the different ganglion that are present. So it might synapse with a postganglionic neuron in that first ganglion that it comes across from its path. It may ascend or descend to a higher or lower ganglion before synapsing with postganglionic neurons. So it doesn't have to happen with the one immediately next to it. It may go up higher or lower in the tract in order to get to the appropriate level of the body. Or it may continue without synapsing through the sympathetic trunk ganglion to a prevertebral ganglion where it synapses with the postganglionic one later on. So parasympathetic preganglionic neurons synapse to postganglionic neurons in terminal ganglia. So that's essentially how you get the action and output that you're looking for. So this is the pathway of parasympathetic fibers, right? So it'll have the spinal nerve root, which is where they go out at the same level that they came in. So essentially it'll be like if sensory information goes in, it'll come right back out. That's when it happens at the spinal nerve root. It'll have sympathetic chain root though, where it can go up a chain and out of a spinal nerve. So that would be like it traveling in and then coming out at a different level that's present here, right? It goes in and it communicates, it goes and communicates with whatever it needs to, and then comes out at an appropriate place. Or it's got the collateral ganglion root, which is where it goes out the splanchnic nerve to a collateral ganglion. Okay, so what are the organs innervated by the sympathetic nervous system? You've got structures that are innervated by each spinal nerve, right? And so some examples are like the sweat glands, the erector pili muscles. Those are the ones that like make your arm hairs stand up, like when you get cold. Blood vessels to the skin and skeletal muscles. And then you have the thoracic and cranial plexuses, and those supply like the heart and the lungs, the esophagus, and thoracic blood vessels. Then there are plexuses around the carotid artery to the head structures. And then you have splanchnic nerve that go to prevertebral ganglia, and they supply the GI tract from the stomach to the rectum, the urinary and reproductive organs. So this is where you can see the ganglion plexuses. It kind of helps to visualize it like this so you can see the actual like neuronal network that is going down this area, right? So you can see all these structures that you'll normally look at, within the thorax and the abdomen. So like this is your aorta, you see your diaphragm, your vena cava coming up through here, your kidneys, your adrenal glands sitting on top of them, and all running along this area from like the esophagus and the aorta are these nerves, right? And so all these little like circles right here are kind of like small ganglia before you reach bigger parts, right? So you'll see labeled in here, you've got like your greater splanchnic nerve, your lesser splanchnic nerve running up against it. A lot of this is, I won't say easier to see, but better to interpret when you do the actual dissection and can look inside of the animal and really appreciate where those nerves actually are. But these are the plexuses and ganglia of all the nerves kind of interconnected in order to be able to work with each other here. So what's the circuitry of the sympathetic nervous system? There's this divergence, right? And so the divergence is where each preganglionic cell synapses on many postganglionic cells. And so it's got this mass activation, and that's because of divergence. You know, it doesn't have to fire on each individual cell. It can do it on a group, excuse me, in order to be able to have this mass activation. So it's got multiple target organs, and that helps rationale like the fight or flight response, right? Because all of that happens like immediately. You know, like you see something that scares you, whatever, and your whole body goes into action like at once. And so that's why this process can happen. So when you think of your adrenal gland, it's like a modified cluster of postganglionic cell bodies that will release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. So that was all sympathetic, right? So now we're going to talk parasympathetic. This is where the cranial outflow consists of preganglionic axons that extend from the brain stem into 4 cranial nerves, right? And so that cranial outflow consists of 4 pairs of ganglia and plexuses associated with the vagus nerve. Remember, that's cranial nerve number 10. The sacral parasympathetic outflow consists of preganglionic axons in the anterior roots of the 2nd through 4th sacral nerves, and they form the pelvic splanchnic nerve. So, right, remember we talked about all of those things. That's your picture in order to be able to see it, right? You've got preganglionic cell bodies that are found in the 4 cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem. So there you see 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the S2 to S4 in the spinal cord. So there you go, 1, 2. Those are them from sacral 2, 3, and 4. The postganglionic cell bodies are really close to the wall of the target organ in the terminal ganglia. So they're like right up against wherever they're trying to affect. So you've got the oculomotor nerve, which has the ciliary ganglion in the orbit, the ciliary muscle, and pupillary constrictor muscle inside the eyeball. Then you've got the facial nerve, which goes to the pterygopalatine and submandibular ganglions. This supplies tears, salivary, and nasal secretions. And then there's the glossopharyngeal part, which has the otic ganglion, and it supplies the parotid salivary gland. And then the vagus nerve, which has many parts that supply the heart, the pulmonary, and GI tract, as far as and it goes all the way to like the midpoint of the colon. It's parasympathetic sacral fibers. They form the pelvic splanchnic nerves. So you can see those here, they're pelvic splanchnic nerves. The preganglionic fibers will end on terminal ganglia in the walls of the target organs, like we discussed before. So this innervates smooth muscle and glands in the colon, ureters, the bladder, and reproductive organs. Ooh, so all of that is going into your parasympathetic and your sympathetic branches of your autonomic nervous system. So now let's talk about, and so all of that, I guess, was like anatomically speaking how this takes place, right? So now we can get into the neurotransmitters and receptors for them. So your autonomic neurotransmitters. These are classified as either cholinergic or adrenergic neurons based on the neurotransmitter released. So cholinergic, think like acetylcholine, that's going to be cholinergic, and adrenergic is stuff that's coming from the adrenal gland, so like epinephrine, norepinephrine. So like we just said, adrenergic is going to be these up here. Cholinergic is going to have the responses that are like down here. So as far as cholinergic neurons and receptors, cholinergic neurons will release acetylcholine. So what are the ones that do that? That is all preganglionic neurons, as well as all parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. There are a few sympathetic postganglionic neurons, but these that secrete acetylcholine, but these are mostly the ones that are going to like sweat glands. So excitation or inhibition will occur with this neurotransmitter depending upon the receptor subtype and the organ involved that it goes to. So that means that it can have excitatory potential or inhibitory potential. It all just depends on where it's going in the body. It's more about cholinergic neurons and receptors. These receptors are integral membrane proteins in the postsynaptic plasma membrane. So they are going to be in the membrane of whatever target that they're going to. So there are two types of cholinergic receptors. There's going to be nicotinic and muscarinic. Activation of nicotinic receptors is what's going to cause excitation of the postsynaptic cell. Nicotinic receptors are found on like the dendrites and cell bodies of autonomic nervous system cells and at the neuromuscular junction. That's what NMJ is. But then activation of muscarinic receptors can cause either excitation or inhibition depending on the cell that bears the receptors. So remember we talked about how like cholinergic neurons can either have excitatory or inhibitory potentials. That's going to depend on what kind of receptor that they go to. So if it's going to a nicotinic receptor, it's only going to be excitatory. But if it goes to a muscarinic receptor, it could be excitatory or inhibitory depending on where in the body that cell is. But the muscarinic receptors are found on the plasma membranes of all parasympathetic effectors. So now we'll go on to adrenergic neurons and receptors. So adrenergic neurons release norepinephrine. So that's usually depicted by NE. And so this happens from postganglionic sympathetic neurons only. So this norepinephrine can excite or inhibit organs depending on the receptors that they go to. But norepinephrine will linger at the synapse until it's enzymatically inactivated by monoamine oxidase, or that's often called MAO, M-A-O, or catechol-O-methyltransferase, and that's COMT, or COMT is what people often refer to it as. So that norepinephrine will stay in the synapse, so it will continuously cause effects until it is enzymatically inactivated by MAO or COMT. The main types of adrenergic receptors. So, we talked about how there are different types of cholinergic receptors, whether they be nicotinic or muscarinic. And so there are also different types of adrenergic receptors. So the main types that we'll talk about are alpha and beta receptors. These receptors are further classified into subtypes. So there's even more for you to remember, right? So you can have alpha 1 and beta 1 receptors, and those will produce excitation. But alpha 2 and beta 2 receptors will cause inhibition. Beta 3 receptors, which are present in brown fat. Remember, we talked about brown fat being in like hibernating animals or really young animals. But those beta 3 receptors help increase thermogenesis. And that's essentially what brown fat is for. Remember, is helping to retain heat. So that makes sense why those are there. So the effects of it, though, are triggered by adrenergic neurons. Typically, the effects are typically longer lasting than those triggered by cholinergic neurons. And remember, that's because that norepinephrine will stay in the synapse until it is broken down and removed. So it can have longer lasting effects if those enzymes, and remember those are the MAO or the COMT, aren't present in order to break it down. And so there are receptor agonists and antagonists. An agonist is a substance that binds to and activates a receptor. It mimics the effect of a natural neurotransmitter or hormone. An antagonist is a substance that binds to and blocks a receptor, preventing a natural neurotransmitter or hormone from exerting its effect. So remember when we talked about like agonist and antagonist muscles, where an agonist is the one that's going to make it happen and the antagonist kind of counteracts that movement. That's essentially what's happening with agonist and antagonist hormones or neurotransmitters. So the agonist is going to be a substance that binds to the receptor, and it's essentially going to like mock the natural neurotransmitter to make something happen, where an antagonist is something that will bind to a receptor and block the space that an agonist or a natural neurotransmitter or hormone could get, which is going to prevent the action from occurring. So drugs that can serve as agonists or antagonists selectively activate or block ANS receptors. So a lot of pharmacological products are put in place in order to mimic these responses, in order to force an adaptation within the body in order to help whatever it is that you're trying to fix. So what are some physiological effects of the CNS? Most body organs receive dual innervation. So that, remember, that dual innervation means that it's innervated by both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The hypothalamus is going to regulate the balance between them. And so that balance is called tone, like that natural tone or kind of resting state, not resting state, but like the homeostatic orientation of these systems, right? Your parasympathetic and your sympathetic systems. So your hypothalamus is going to regulate those activity levels so that they balance out each other for normal operations. Some organs only have sympathetic innervation, like sweat glands, the adrenal medulla, the erector pili muscles, and many blood vessels. And so those are controlled by regulation of the tone of the sympathetic system. So what are some sympathetic responses? Dominance by the sympathetic system is caused by physical or emotional stress. So people call those E situations. And so those are those contributors to it. But it's E situations because it's referred to like emergency, embarrassment, excitement, exercise. So those kind of like high energy, like quick, like, like those kind of moments, those are going to be your sympathetic responses. And that's when they'll dominate. So it's like an alarm reaction. That's your fight or flight response. That's kicking into play there. So what you'll see with that is like the dilation of the pupils. Remember, like the your pupils, the black spot in the eye, that'll get larger in order to allow more light to come in. They'll have an increased heart rate as well as forced contraction and blood pressure. So that is pumping more blood out for you to be able to have more oxygen available to all the muscles in case you need to act like quickly, for whatever fight or flight response you've got, as well as decreased blood flow to non-essential organs. If you're in an emergency situation, your body doesn't need to be thinking about, digesting currently, or like smelling, warm cookies that are coming from wherever. So it's like decreasing blood flow so that way it can maximize that oxygen output for whatever it is that immediately needs it. And it'll increase blood flow to skeletal and cardiac muscles for you to be able to move and get out of whatever situation it is that you're in. The airways will dilate and the respiratory rate will increase. So that will allow for more air to get through into the lungs, as well as like the rate that you breathe increases, again, in order to allow more oxygen to be present to utilize whatever it is that the body needs to do in order to get away from whatever that fear stimulus is. And the blood glucose level will increase because all of these actions need energy, and glucose is going to provide the body with energy in order to carry that out. So those glucose levels will rise. This is a long-lasting effect due to norepinephrine being left in the synaptic cleft and the release of it by the adrenal gland. So it being more so released as well as not being uptook, these can be long-lasting effects until you burn out. Now, as far as parasympathetic responses will go, this enhances rest and digest activities. Remember, we said sympathetic is fight or flight, parasympathetic is rest and digest. These mechanisms are ones that will help the body conserve and restore energy during times of rest. So that way you're not just burning it. Like, this will help you kind of come down and relax, as well as like store things away to be utilized for later. So this normally dominates over sympathetic impulses. You're not always going to be in that E situation, right? So the parasympathetic ones is what's normally going to dominate for like everyday functions. But they call the parasympathetic SLUD response, right? So that's going to be salivation, lacrimation, urination, digestion, and defecation. Those are the things that are occurring, and that's like if all of those are happening at the same time, you're having a parasympathetic response. And it's got 3 decreases that go with it though, and those are decreased heart rate, decreased diameter of the airways, and decreased diameter of the pupil. So remember, when we were talking about sympathetic nervous system, we talked about your pupils dilating, your your pupils dilating, your heart rate increasing, and your airways getting larger in order to allow more air in, more light in, all this stuff so the body can take that information in and quite literally run with it, right? But when you're resting, you need to come down off of all of that. So it's decreased heart rate in order to get you to a resting state. Your airways decrease because you don't need to hyperventilate essentially from too much oxygen being present, and you decrease that diameter of the pupil in order to allow less light in to balance out whatever activities are taking place. So what can stimulate this kind of fear is, well, this kind of response is like paradoxical fear, when there is no escape route or no way to win. So your fight or flight kicks in when you think you have a chance to get out of there, right? But your parasympathetic response can kick in when there is like no hope left. So like when people get really, really scared, or even, like dogs sometimes when they get really, really scared and they're backed into a corner and don't know where to go, they'll pee on themselves, right? Or like people will do that as well. That's that parasympathetic response coming in because your body's just kind of like letting it all go. Like that's that like no escape, no hope left kind of fear. And so that paradoxical fear again is like a massive activation of the parasympathetic division. So you lose control over those like senses where you normally have a little bit of hold on, like your urination and defecation response. And so this is just a summary of the physiological effects of the autonomic nervous system, right? So you can have sympathetic responses prepare the body for emergency situations. That's your fight or flight. And parasympathetic regulates activities that conserve and restore body energy. So that's energy conservation, restorative system. That's your rest and digest. There's a table that kind of summarizes all the glands and cardiac muscle and smooth muscle that are stimulated by this. But remember, if it's autonomic nervous system, it's those three things. It's cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And so this is where we're going to stop for now as like this particular section. We've only got a few slides left to go for the nervous system, but we'll pick it up at integration and control of autonomic functions. So good luck to you all and happy studying.